Today we are on the 12th week and last chapter of Barbara Brown Taylor's book, An Altar in the World, A Geography of Faith. In it, she argues that there is no way to God except for real life in the real world. And so she gives us 12 ordinary practices to try that can help us feel connected to God on a daily basis. We have moved through waking up to God, paying attention, wearing skin, walking on the earth, getting lost, encountering others, living with purpose, saying no, carrying water, feeling pain, and being present to God. And this week we come to the last practice, the practice of pronouncing blessings or benediction. In my role as an ordained minister, I've had the privilege of pronouncing blessings in many different situations, over babies, youth, and adults at baptism, with the dying in hospital, over communion elements to be shared, at celebrations of life and funerals, at confirmations and graduations, at mealtimes, in new homes or over new cars, at meetings, and of course each Sunday at the close of worship services. Now, some might be tempted to think that blessings should only be done by people like me in official ministry positions. But then someone sneezes nearby and we bless them automatically. It's funny that the situation that we might feel the most comfortable offering a blessing is over a sneeze, even of a stranger. But many of you might also be used to saying blessings over food, either aloud or to yourself. And most people in our society have secularized blessings, saying things like, drive safely, or be careful, or good luck on that test, in a very blessing-ish kind of way. We direct our intention and goodwill and ask the universe or God to watch over and help and protect, very much like a blessing. Barbara Brown Taylor encourages us to think about pronouncing blessings as a spiritual practice and to not overthink it, to just do it. We can offer these blessings anywhere, even to inanimate objects or elements of nature. She tells a story about a class she taught in which she instructed her students to not only read Wendell Berry's poems about nature, but then to go outside on their break from class and read them to a tree. The students were aghast, but most were obedient and gave it a try. And she said several returned to the classroom as converts. One student said, "Poetry's just not my thing. But when I read one of them to a tree, like you said, it sounded different to me. It was like the words had an inside and an outside, and I had only read the outside. Reading them to the tree, I heard the inside. The words were so beautiful, I almost cried." In blessing the tree, the student found themselves blessed. Barbara Brown Taylor goes on to speak about the Jewish practice of brakoth, of blessing prayers. Observant Jews have a blessing prayer for everything: waking up, getting dressed, eating, going on a journey, washing, entering a house, going to sleep. And we hear an echo of that practice in our communion prayers as we remember Jesus at table giving thanks for the bread and the cup as he gathers with his friends. And many of us practice saying grace at meals, at least on special occasions. But the idea of bringing prayers of thanksgiving and blessing to ordinary times of day is a practice that can remind us of God's constant presence and to help us to pay attention and be aware of that presence. In today's scripture passage, we hear the parable of Jesus called the parable of the sower. But even though it's called the parable of the sower, the focus seems to be on the soil, or lack thereof, the types of soil or ground that the seeds are cast into, and what the results are. The path where the birds eat up the seed, the rocky soil where there isn't depth for long-term growth, the thorns where competing plants choke out the new growth, and finally the good soil where an unbelievable harvest results. Now, many of Jesus' parables are given to us without explanation, but some of them, like this one, come with a particular interpretation. Joachim Jermes, a German theologian, Lutheran, argues that there are different layers of tradition at work here. He theorizes that the parable itself is an authentic saying of Jesus that was left open to interpretation. As Jesus would say, let them who have ears hear. But he says that when the Gospels were written, an additional layer was added to help explain the parable to those who would be listening to it. He called these explanations the early church layer because it represents how the early church interpreted this particular parable. Now, whether you think his theory holds water or not, the explanation that's given in Matthew asks us to use the parable to think about what kind of soil our hearts or lives might be. But what I find more interesting to think about this week in particular is what kind of farmer the sower is. Because if any of you know farmers who grow crops, you know that they are very careful kinds of people. Seeds are expensive, as are fertilizers and all the equipment that is used to give the seeds their best chance. A smart farmer will ensure that they are sowing their seeds in the best possible environment. Tilled soil that has been given rest and alternate crops and nutrients to ensure that it remains healthy and able to let the new seeds grow best. But in this parable, we have a farmer who is just scattering the seeds everywhere, willy-nilly. The farmer isn't worrying at all about the cost of the seed, but simply casts it everywhere, on paths, on rocks, on thorns, on soil, all over their property, not seeming to care where the seeds land. And it's true that much of the farmer's experiment doesn't work. The seeds that fall on the paths, on the rocks, and on thorns don't form a lasting crop. But the seeds that do fall on good soil, the harvest is beyond imagining. 30 times, 60 times, 100 times the usual crop. Unbelievable returns. It's almost like the farmer is rewarded for their careless, generous, overly abundant sowing of seeds. Because even if you lose 75% of your crop, if that remaining 25% is bringing in 100 times the usual, you are still majorly ahead of the game. But what does this have to do with us and have to do with blessings? Well, first, it tells us about the God who loves us, the God who invests in us, even when we are not at our best. Because truthfully, we aren't always the good soil. Sometimes we are shallow and rocky. Sometimes we are thorny. Sometimes we are a pathway that others have trod upon. And maybe really we are everything at once. Parts of us are deep and rich and open to growth. Parts of us are thorny and stony. Parts of us feel flattened and under attack. But the good news of the parable is that God blesses us anyway, always and every time, not counting the cost when we are not able or willing to receive. God just continues to invest in us, trusting that when the moment is right, when we are able to be open and vulnerable, the seed will take root and transform us. What an example for us to follow. to invite us to be generous and carefree gardeners, casting blessings as far as the eye can see in all directions, not worrying about whether the recipients of our blessing are worthy or willing or ready or resistant. To bless for the sake of blessing and trust that in the end, the harvest will be amazing. Barbara Brown Taylor says that those who have practiced pronouncing blessings throughout the centuries have come to some common wisdom that may be helpful for those of us who are trying to follow. The first piece of wisdom is that a blessing does not confer holiness. The holiness is already there, especially if the object of your blessing is a person or a creature, an element of nature. It already participates in the holiness of God because it is part of creation, as we all are. But we can also perceive the holiness in things that are just things as well, because of their function. I can bless the rooms in a house because I am joining with God's desire that the home be a place of safety and nurturing. I bless rings to connect with God's dream that they be symbols of loyalty and self-giving. I can bless a backpack to affirm God's care for the child who wears it and the hope that they will find their journey of learning to be challenging and rewarding. The second piece of wisdom is that the practice of pronouncing blessings can free you from making judgments about what things are good and what things are bad. Barbara Brown Taylor explains by telling a story of a friend who could not sleep through the night for years because of a recurring nightmare about a monster. And after trying in his dream to flee it, to fight it, to kill it, he continually would feel himself infected by it, to be taken over by it. And then one night, while dreaming, it occurred to him to try blessing it. Now he had to repeat this blessing over and over and over again. But as he did it, something shifted. And finally, the monster turned around and never came back. We can choose to bless things that we don't like. We can choose to bless those we wish to never see again. To bless those parts of ourselves that we don't like, whether they're body parts or personality flaws or past regrets. We can choose, even in the face of disaster, to stop and give thanks for life and offer a blessing into a terrible circumstance. It won't hurt anything, and it just might help. One of my favorite blessings is from the book of Numbers, chapter 6, where God gives Moses words that he wants Aaron and the priests to use to bless the Israelites. We use it to this day, most often at baptism. May God bless you and keep you. God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God lift up God's countenance upon you and give you peace. Does that sound familiar? Might be slightly different from words from what you're used to. But I love it because it's a reminder and a promise, this blessing. It has no magic to start and stop God's blessing. The words are there to remind God's people that they already belong to God, that God's blessing already exists, and that they exist in relationship to that blessing. The passage says that this is how the Israelites will be named, is through this blessing. This is how they will know whose they are. God bless you and keep you. God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. God lift up God's countenance upon you and give you peace. A reminder and a promise. I want to give you an experiment to try using that blessing for yourself. You can look it up in Numbers 6. Try using it once or twice a day, looking at yourself in the mirror, and offer it to yourself. Say it to your dog or your cat if you have one, or to a favorite plant or tree. Look through a photo album or the pictures on your phone and offer it out loud to the person whose picture you stop at, the person you're looking at and thinking about. We are blessed and called to be a blessing. The extravagant gardener, the carefree farmer, our generous God of abundance continues to cast blessings into the world, into our lives, into our communities, and we are called to do the same. As we practice waking up to God and paying attention, connecting with other people through our shared experiences of laboring and getting lost and feeling pain, and as we choose to use our life energy with purpose and presence, saying no when we need to, and choosing to pray through each of our daily activities, we discover, with Barbara Brown Taylor's help, that God is closer than we expect, and holiness can be found in the everyday. It makes sense to me that our author ends her book here with blessing, with benediction. For as we practice ways of connecting with God each day, we naturally extend that experience outward, blessing others as we have been blessed. I thank you for joining me on this 12-week journey. I hope you found at least one or two of these daily practices that you can use regularly to awaken your spirit and remind yourself that you're loved. If you've missed any of the practices and would like to learn more about them, you can either ask me to borrow the book, or you can go onto our YouTube channel and find all the services since March that we've been doing this series. Go to the right playlist and just click right on the sermon if you want to hear about it. Bless you, my friends, and be a blessing to others. I invite you to sing with me from Voices United number 716, My Life Flows On. How can I keep from singing?